The desert sun beat down mercilessly on forward-operating Base Falcon, somewhere in the hostile terrain of Iraq. Inside the air-conditioned intelligence center, Captain Sarah Mitchell sat hunched over 3 computer monitors, her eyes scanning endless streams of data that most people would find incomprehensible. Numbers, coordinates, intercepted communications, satellite imagery, all flowing together like a digital river that only she seemed to understand. Sarah was 28 years old, though the stress of deployment had added fine lines around her green eyes. Her dark hair was pulled back in the regulation bun that every female soldier wore, and her uniform bore the insignia of military intelligence. To everyone on the base, she was simply the analyst, the woman who could find patterns where others saw only chaos, who could predict enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. What nobody knew, what her personnel file would never reveal, was that before joining military intelligence, Sarah had been something else entirely. She had been a sniper with the Joint Special Operations Command, one of the most elite and secretive units in the American military. That chapter of her life was sealed, classified, buried under layers of security clearances that even most generals couldn't access. The transition from trigger puller to data analyst hadn't been her choice. 3 years earlier, during a mission in Afghanistan, everything had changed. Sarah's spotter, a young sergeant named, had been killed when their position was overrun. She had fought her way out, taking down 11 enemy fighters in close combat after her rifle ran out of ammunition. She survived, but something inside her broke that day. The nightmares came first, then the panic attacks, then the moment during a training exercise when she found herself unable to pull the trigger, her hands shaking so badly that she couldn't hold the rifle steady. The JSOC command didn't discharge her. People with her skills were too valuable, too rare. Instead, they offered her a different path. Use that incredible mind of hers, that ability to read terrain and predict human behavior, and apply it to intelligence work. Sarah had accepted, grateful for a second chance even as part of her felt like a failure. She threw herself into her new role with the same intensity she'd once brought to sniper training. Within 18 months, she'd become one of the most effective intelligence analysts in the theater, credited with helping to take down 3 high-value targets and preventing countless attacks on coalition forces. But the past had a way of catching up to people, especially in a war zone. The door to the intelligence center swung open, bringing with it a blast of hot air and a tall man in dusty combat fatigues. Major Rick, the base operations officer, crossed the room in long strides. His face was grim. "Mitchell, we've got a situation," he said without preamble. "Need your eyes on something." Sarah turned away from her monitors, nodding the tension in his jaw. Was a seasoned combat veteran who rarely showed stress. Whatever he was about to show her was serious. He pulled up a chair and opened his laptop, angling the screen toward her. 3 hours ago, a convoy from Fob Hammer was ambushed 20 clicks northwest of here. 2 vehicles destroyed, 6 wounded, 3 KIA. The attack was coordinated, professional. They used IEDs to disable the lead and rear vehicles, then hit the middle ones with RPGs and small arms fire. Sarah studied the map on his screen, her analytical mind already working. That's the 3rd convoy hit in that sector in 2 weeks, same tactics each time. Exactly, and it's the same group. We intercepted some chatter afterward. They're calling themselves the Ghost Brigade, led by a man named Al, former Iraqi army officer trained by Republican Guard before the invasion. Smart, disciplined, and he's been recruiting ex-military personnel. This isn't some ragtag insurgent cell. These guys know what they're doing. Sarah pulled up her own files, cross-referencing known insurgent groups. Al, I've got 3 mentions of him in the past month. He's been quiet since 2005, probably rebuilding after we took down his network. If he's active again, that's a problem. It gets worse, continued. Intelligence from Baghdad says Al has acquired some serious hardware. We're talking heavy machine guns, possibly some anti-aircraft missiles. And there's chatter about a major attack being planned, something big. Against what target? That's what we need you to figure out. Closed his laptop and met her eyes. Command wants a full workup on Al and his network. Locations, patterns, likely targets, everything. And they want it fast. We've got a JSOC team flying in tomorrow to conduct operations based on your intelligence. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest at the mention of JSOC. She forced it down, nodding professionally. I'll need access to all signals intelligence from the past 6 months, updated satellite imagery, and any human intelligence reports from local sources. You'll have it within the hour. Stood, then paused. Mitchell, I know you usually work alone, but this is too big. I'm assigning Lieutenant to assist you. He's good with data mining. Sir, I work better. That's not a request, Captain. His voice was firm but not unkind. Get me something actionable. Lives depend on it. After he left, Sarah sat in silence for a moment, staring at her reflection in the dark monitor. Lives depend on it. The same words that had been spoken to her before every sniper mission. The weight of those words had never gotten lighter. She pulled up a fresh database and began to work. Over the next 12 hours, Sarah barely moved from her station. Lieutenant proved useful, his nimble fingers flying over keyboards as he pulled data from a dozen different sources. Sarah built a picture of Al that was far more disturbing than anyone had realized. The man wasn't just a former officer. He'd been an intelligence specialist himself, trained in psychological operations and unconventional warfare. After the invasion, he disappeared into the underground, slowly and carefully rebuilding a network of fighters. But unlike other insurgent leaders who relied on zealotry and brute force, Al was methodical. He planned his operations like chess moves, always thinking 3 steps ahead. The convoy attacks weren't random. When Sarah plotted them on a map along with other insurgent activity in the region, a pattern emerged. Al was testing coalition response times, learning how forces moved, where they were weak. Each attack was designed to gather information as much as inflict casualties. He's planning something, Sarah muttered, more to herself than to. All of this is preparation. Preparation for what? Asked, leaning over to look at her screen. Sarah pulled up satellite imagery of the region, overlaying it with infrastructure maps. Her eyes moved rapidly across the display, that part of her brain trained for sniper work unconsciously calculating distances, angles, fields of fire. And then she saw it. Oh God, she whispered. 25 kilometers west of Fob Falcon was a coalition logistics hub called Camp Victory. It was a sprawling base that served as a supply depot for operations throughout the region. Thousands of personnel, millions of dollars in equipment, and crucially, it was hosting a high-level diplomatic visit in 3 days. A senator from the Armed Services Committee was scheduled to tour the facility along with several high-ranking military officers. The visit was supposed to be secret, but in Iraq, secrets had a way of leaking. And if Al had even a hint of the visit, it would be the perfect target. High-value casualties, massive media coverage, a propaganda victory that would inspire insurgent groups across the country. Sarah ran the calculations in her mind, using the same skills she'd once used to plan sniper positions. If she were going to attack Camp Victory, how would she do it? The base had strong perimeter defenses, but it was large, sprawling. There were blind spots, places where a well-coordinated assault could penetrate before quick reaction forces could respond. She pulled up topographical maps, studying the terrain around the camp. There, to the northwest, a series of low ridges overlooked one section of the perimeter, perfect for positioning heavy weapons. And the recent convoy attacks had all been pulling coalition forces away from that area, thinning the patrols. Get majors now. The lieutenant didn't question her tone, just grabbed the phone. 5 minutes later, burst into the intelligence center along with the base commander, Colonel James Bradford. Sarah laid it out for them, showing her analysis, the patterns, the probable target. Both officers' faces grew darker as she spoke. "You're sure about this?" Bradford asked when she finished. "No, sir, I'm not sure, but the probability is high enough that we can't ignore it. If Al hits that base during the senator's visit, it'll be a disaster." Bradford turned to, "Can we cancel the visit?" "Not our call, sir. That comes from Baghdad. And you know how these political things work. They won't want to look like they're running scared from insurgents. Then we beef up security at Camp Victory. Double the patrols, reinforce the perimeter." Sarah shook her head. "With respect, sir, that won't be enough. If Al is as good as I think he is, he's already accounted for increased security. We need to take the fight to him, disrupt his network before he can launch the attack." "That's where the JSOC team comes in," said. "They're scheduled to arrive at 600. If we can give them target packages, they can conduct raids on Al's known locations." "It's not enough to hit his safe houses," Sarah said, her voice taking on an edge that surprised even her. "Al won't be at any location we know about. He's too smart. We need to draw him out, force him to react." "How?" Bradford asked. Sarah hesitated. The idea that had been forming in her mind was dangerous, probably crazy, but it was the kind of unconventional thinking that JSOC specialized in. We feed him false intelligence. Make him think the senator's visit has been moved up, that it's happening tomorrow instead of 3 days from now. He'll have to scramble, adjust his timeline. When he moves his forces into position, we hit them. The two officers exchanged glances. That's a risky play, Bradford said slowly. If he doesn't take the bait, we've wasted time and resources, and if he does take it but we don't stop him, we could lose a lot of people. I know, sir, but I think it's our best option. Studied her for a long moment. You've been doing this intelligence work for what, 2 years? And before that, you were. He trailed off, clearly aware that her previous assignment was classified. The point is, you think like an operator, not just an analyst. That's useful, but it's also dangerous. Operations like what you're describing, they're not run from behind a computer screen. I understand that, sir. Do you? His gaze was piercing. Because once we set this in motion, there's no stopping it. People will be put in harm's way based on your analysis. Can you handle that responsibility? Sarah met his eyes without flinching. The nightmares, the panic attacks, the guilt over death, all of it was still there, lurking in the dark corners of her mind. But lives were at stake. American lives, Iraqi lives. She joined the military to protect people, and that mission didn't change just because she'd traded a rifle for a keyboard. Yes, sir, I can. Bradford nodded slowly. All right, we'll present your plan to the JSOC team when they arrive. If they sign off on it, we move forward. But Mitchell, you're going to be working directly with them. This is your analysis, so you need to be there to explain it, to adjust if things change. Understood, sir. After the officers left, let out a low whistle. You really think this will work? Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was staring at her monitors again, at the data that had led her to this conclusion. In her old life, she would have been the one on the ground, rifle in hand, waiting for the enemy to appear in her scope. Now she would be sending others to do that work, making life-or-death decisions from the safety of the operations center. It felt wrong somehow, like she was shirking responsibility. But it was also the reality of her new role. The war had changed her, taken away her ability to be that person behind the rifle. But it hadn't taken away her mind, her ability to think like a hunter. It has to work, she finally said, because if it doesn't, a lot of people are going to die. The JSOC team arrived before dawn, their Black Hawk helicopter touching down in a swirl of dust on the far side of the base. Sarah watched from the operations center as 6 figures in full combat gear disembarked, moving with the casual confidence of men who'd done this 1,000 times. She felt her stomach tighten. JSOC operators were a different breed, elite soldiers trained for the most dangerous missions. Working with them meant confronting the world she'd left behind, the person she used to be. Major appeared at her side. You ready? As I'll ever be. The briefing room was cramped, made smaller by the presence of the JSOC team and their equipment. Sarah stood at the front with a laptop connected to a large monitor, her carefully prepared briefing displayed across multiple screens. The team leader was a man who introduced himself simply as Reaper, no rank given. He was in his mid-30s, with the weathered face and cold eyes of someone who'd seen too much combat. The others were equally intimidating, each carrying themselves with that particular alertness that came from constantly operating in hostile territory. Sarah began her briefing, walking them through her analysis of AL's network, the convoy attacks, and her assessment of the threat to Camp Victory. She showed satellite imagery, signals intelligence intercepts, pattern analysis. The operators listened in silence, their attention absolute. When she finished, Reaper leaned back in his chair. So your plan is to dangle bait and see if he bites. What makes you think Al will fall for fake intelligence about the senator's visit being moved up? Because it plays to his operational pattern, Sarah explained. He's cautious, methodical, but he's also opportunistic. If he thinks he has a chance to hit a high-value target with less preparation time, he might take it, especially if he believes coalition forces won't be expecting an attack that soon. Might, one of the other operators said. That's a lot of risk for Might. It is, Sarah agreed. But the alternative is waiting for him to attack on his timeline when he's fully prepared. At least this way, we control the situation. Reaper studied her for a moment. You used to be one of us, didn't you? JSOC. The question caught her off guard. How did you? It's in how you brief. Most intelligence analysts give us information and let us figure out how to use it. You're telling us like you'd be planning the op yourself. Plus, let something slip. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. What happened? Sarah's jaw tightened. That's classified. Fair enough. Reaper stood, walking to the map on the screen. All right, assuming we go with your plan, where do you think Al will position his forces? She pulled up the topographical map she'd studied earlier. If I were him, I'd use these ridges northwest of Camp Victory. They offer the best fields of fire and the most cover. He'd position his heavy weapons there, probably RPG teams and machine guns. Then he'd have assault teams infiltrate closer to the perimeter, waiting for the heavy weapons to create a breach. That's exactly how I'd do it, Reaper said, his respect evident. So we set up kill zones along those ridges, catch them when they move into position. And have a quick reaction force ready to hit any assault teams that get through, Sarah added. They spent the next 3 hours planning the operation in detail. Sarah found herself falling into old rhythms, thinking tactically, considering fields of fire and rally points. It felt both familiar and strange, like putting on a uniform that no longer quite fit. Finally, Reaper turned to her. We're going to need someone who knows this intelligence inside and out on site during the operation. Someone who can adjust the plan in real time if Al does something unexpected. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. You mean at Camp Victory? No, I mean on those ridges with my team. You're the one who knows how this guy thinks. If things go sideways, we need you there to read the situation. That's not my job anymore, Sarah said, adding how defensive she sounded. I'm an analyst, not an operator. You're whatever the mission needs you to be. Reaper's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. And this mission needs someone who can think like both an analyst and a sniper. That's you. Major cleared his throat. Captain Mitchell has been cleared for intelligence work, not combat operations. I'm not sure I can authorize. Then get authorization, Reaper interrupted, because I'm not running this op without her. The room fell silent. Sarah felt everyone's eyes on her, waiting for her response. This was what she'd been running from for 3 years, the thing she'd convinced herself she could never do again. Going back into the field, putting herself in a position where she might have to take another life, to watch another teammate die. But Reaper was right. This was her analysis, her plan. If it went wrong, if people died because she'd miscalculated, she needed to be there to fix it. That was the responsibility she'd accepted when she'd proposed this operation. The armory at Fob Falcon smelled like gun oil and metal, a scent that brought back more memories than Sarah cared to acknowledge. She stood before a locked cage in the back, watching as the armorer, a grizzled master sergeant, worked through 3 different combinations on heavy-duty locks. These weapons aren't in our regular inventory, he muttered, pulling the cage door open. Special requisition from Baghdad. Someone up the chain really wanted you to have access to these. Inside the cage, wrapped in protective cases, was equipment Sarah hadn't touched in 3 years. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the first case, revealing a custom M110 semi-automatic sniper system. The rifle was immaculate, obviously maintained to perfection despite years in storage. Next to it was a case containing her old spotting scope, night vision equipment, and ammunition specially selected for long-range precision work. The armorer watched her handle the rifle with the reverence of someone reuniting with an old friend. You know, I heard stories about a JSOC sniper they called the Ghost. Supposedly, she could hit targets at distances most people couldn't even see. 43 confirmed kills in 18 months. He paused. That you? Sarah checked the rifle's action, muscle memory taking over. You believe everything you hear, Sergeant. No, ma'am, but I believe what I see, and I see someone who knows exactly what to do with that weapon. He handed her a box of ammunition. Whatever you're about to do, give 'em hell. Back in her quarters, Sarah laid out all her gear on the narrow bed. The tactical vest still fit perfectly, though it felt heavier than she remembered. She methodically checked each piece of equipment, ensuring everything was functional. This was the ritual that had kept her alive on dozens of missions, and she fell into it now despite her racing heart. There was a knock on her door. It's open, she called. Lieutenant stepped inside, his eyes widening when he saw the gear spread across her bed. So the rumors are true, you were special operations. Was being the operative word. Sarah continued her equipment check without looking at him. Did you need something, Lieutenant? I wanted to give you these. He handed her a tablet computer. I created a program that will give you real-time access to all our intelligence feeds during the operation. Satellite imagery, signals, intercepts, everything. Figured you might need it. Sarah took the tablet, genuinely impressed. This is good work, thank you. He shifted uncomfortably. Captain, can I ask you something? Why'd you leave Special Operations? From what I've heard, you were one of the best. For a moment, Sarah considered giving him the official line, the sanitized version that appeared in her personnel file. But something about the genuine curiosity in his young face made her reconsider. I lost my spotter on a mission in Afghanistan, she said quietly. Man named, he was 22, engaged to his high school sweetheart. We were compromised during an operation, and I made a call that got him killed. After that, I couldn't. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I couldn't trust my judgment anymore, couldn't pull the trigger when it mattered. But you're going back out there now. How do you know you won't freeze up again? It was the question Sarah had been asking herself since agreeing to join the operation. I don't know, she admitted. But this time, I'm not going to be the one pulling the trigger. I'm there to think, to analyze. That's what I'm good at now. Nodded slowly. For what it's worth, Captain, I think you're one of the best analysts I've ever worked with. You see things other people miss. That's going to save lives tomorrow. After he left, Sarah sat on her bed, holding the tablet in one hand and her old rifle in the other. Two different versions of herself, two different ways of fighting the same war. Tomorrow would determine whether she could reconcile them or if the weight of her past would finally crush her. The briefing the next morning was attended by every senior officer on the base. Colonel Bradford stood at the front of the room, his face grave as he outlined the operation. At 300 hours, we will begin disseminating false intelligence through channels we know have been compromised. The intelligence will indicate that Senator Harrison's visit to Camp Victory has been moved up to today at 1400 hours. If Captain Mitchell's analysis is correct, this will force Al to accelerate his attack timeline. Bradford pulled up a map showing the terrain around Camp Victory. JSOC teams will be in position on these ridges by 500, establishing overwatch positions. Captain Mitchell will be with Team 1, providing real-time intelligence analysis. Additional quick reaction forces will be staged here and here, ready to respond if Al's forces attempt to breach the Camp Victory perimeter. One of the battalion commanders raised his hand. Sir, what if Al doesn't take the bait? What if he sees through the deception? Then we've lost nothing but time, Bradford replied. The senator's actual visit will proceed as planned in 3 days, with heightened security based on the intelligence Captain Mitchell has provided. But I believe the captain's assessment is sound. Al is methodical, but he's also aggressive when he sees an opportunity. This will be too tempting for him to pass up. The Black Hawks lifted off at 4:30, flying low and fast through the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah sat wedged between two JSOC operators, her rifle secured across her lap. The tablet had given her strapped to her vest. Despite the familiar weight of her gear, despite falling back into old habits, she felt like an imposter. These men around her were active combat operators, living this life every day. She was an analyst playing soldier. Reaper's voice came through her headset. 5 minutes to LZ. Remember, we insert fast and quiet. Al might have spotters watching the area, so we need to be in position before first light. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust, and the team poured out in a choreographed rush that Sarah remembered from countless training exercises. Her body moved on autopilot, following the operator in front of her as they sprinted toward the terrain was rocky and unforgiving, but it offered good cover and excellent sight lines toward Camp Victory, exactly as she'd predicted. The team spread out, each operator taking a position that provided both a good field of fire and concealment from enemy observation. Reaper positioned himself next to Sarah behind a cluster of large rocks that overlooked the entire valley. Set up your observation post here. You've got the best view of the approaches we think Al will use. Sarah deployed her spotting scope and settled into position, the familiar ritual of preparing a hide bringing a strange sense of calm. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern horizon, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. All teams radio check, Reaper whispered into his radio. One by one, the other JSOC elements reported in. They had 8 operators on this, with 2 more teams positioned on adjacent high ground. On paper, it looked like enough. But Sarah knew that in combat, plans rarely survived contact with the enemy. She pulled out S's tablet and accessed the intelligence feeds. The false information about the senator's visit had been disseminated 3 hours ago through a source that coalition intelligence knew had previously leaked information to insurgent groups. If Al had taken the bait, he would be moving his forces into position right now. The morning dragged on with agonizing slowness. Sarah scanned the terrain through her scope, looking for any sign of enemy movement. The other operators remained perfectly still, their discipline impressive even by special operations standards. These were men who could wait for days if necessary, enduring heat, cold, and discomfort without complaint. At 8:47, Sarah's tablet chimed softly. New signals intelligence had just come through. She read the intercepted radio transmission, her heart rate accelerating. "Reaper," she whispered. "We've got chatter. 2 vehicles moving north from a location outside. The transmission mentions the American senator and moving now." "That's it," Reaper confirmed. "He took the bait, time to target." Sarah pulled up the map, calculating distances and likely routes. If they're coming from, they'll have to take the main highway until they get within 10 clicks of here. Then they'll break off into the desert to avoid checkpoints. Best guess, they'll be in position by 1100. "All teams, this is Reaper," the team leader said into his radio. "We have confirmation of enemy movement. Weapons tight until I give the word. Remember, we want to catch them while they're setting up before they can get organized." The next 2 hours tested Sarah's nerves more than any combat she'd experienced. The waiting, the uncertainty, the constant second-guessing of her analysis. What if she'd miscalculated? What if Al was smarter than she'd given him credit for and saw through the deception? What if he'd sent his forces somewhere else entirely? At 10:47, one of the forward observers reported movement. "I've got vehicles, 3 technical trucks with mounted weapons approaching from the west. They're taking the exact route Mitchell predicted." Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Her analysis had been correct, but that meant the dangerous part was just beginning. Through her spotting scope, she watched as the trucks stopped about 2 kilometers from the... Men poured out, perhaps 20 of them, all armed with assault rifles and RPGs. They moved with military precision, not the usual chaotic rush of poorly trained insurgents. "These guys know what they're doing," Reaper muttered beside her. "Al definitely recruited former military personnel." The insurgents began setting up positions on a lower about 800 meters from where the JSOC team lay hidden. They were establishing a base of fire position, exactly where Sarah had predicted. From there, they would have clear lines of sight to one section of Camp Victory's perimeter. But something was nagging at Sarah as she watched them work. The positioning was correct, the tactics sound, but the numbers were wrong. 20 men wasn't enough for the kind of assault she'd assessed Al would need. Where were the rest of his forces? She pulled up the tablet, scanning through the latest intelligence reports. More signals intercepts had come through in the past 30 minutes, but none of them indicated additional forces moving toward the area. "Reaper," she said urgently, "this doesn't feel right. There aren't enough of them." The team leader lowered his binoculars and looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking maybe Al is smarter than we anticipated. What if he suspected the intelligence might be false? What if this is a probe, a way to test our response? Or what if he's hitting us from another direction entirely?" Reaper finished grimly. He keyed his radio. "TOC, this is Reaper. We need immediate status update on Camp Victory. Any signs of unusual activity on other sides of the perimeter?" The Tactical Operations Center responded within seconds. "Negative, Reaper. All sectors reporting normal. No unusual movement detected." Sarah continued studying the insurgents through her scope. They were working quickly now, setting up heavy machine guns and what looked like a Soviet-era DK, but their positioning was almost too perfect, too expected. It was exactly what a competent military commander would do. Too perfect, too expected. "Oh God," Sarah whispered, "we're the target." Reaper looked at her sharply. "Explain." "Think about it. Al is an intelligence specialist. He knows how we work, knows we'd set up a trap if we suspected an attack. What if the false intelligence about the senator wasn't just bait for him? What if he's using it as bait for us? Draw out our special operations forces, then hit them while they're fixed in position." "That's a pretty sophisticated play," one of the other operators said skeptically. "It's exactly the kind of play Al would make," Sarah insisted. "He's not trying to hit Camp Victory at all. He's trying to inflict casualties on our elite forces, make a propaganda statement. Iraqi resistance defeats American special operations would be worth more to him than killing a senator. Reaper was silent for a moment, his combat-hardened mind working through the implications. If you're right, where's his main force? Sarah was already scanning the terrain, looking at it with new eyes. Not looking for where Al would position forces to attack Camp Victory, but where he'd position them to attack the JSOC teams. There, she said, pointing to a wadi about a kilometer to their east. It's the only approach that would let him get forces close without being seen from our positions. And look at the timing. Those insurgents down there started setting up at exactly 10:47. If I were Al, I'd use that as a distraction, get us focused on them while the real assault force moves into position. TOC, this is Reaper, the team leader said urgently. We need ISR assets on our eastern approach immediately, possible enemy forces in Wadi. Roger, redirecting drone coverage now, stand by. The seconds ticked past with agonizing slowness. Sarah kept her scope trained on the Wadi, looking for any sign of movement. The insurgents on the lower continued their setup work, seemingly oblivious to the JSOC team watching them. Then the TOC came back on the radio, and the operator's voice was tight with tension. Reaper, we have confirmation. Estimate 40 to 50 personnel moving up that wadi toward your position. Multiple vehicles, heavy weapons. They'll be on top of you in less than 10 minutes. All teams, this is Reaper. We have enemy forces approaching from the east. Prepare to break contact and extract. Air support, how far out are you? 12 minutes, came the response from an Apache helicopter team. We don't have 12 minutes, Reaper said flatly. He turned to his team. All right, people, we're going to have to fight our way out of this. Mitchell, you good? Sarah's hands were shaking, that familiar tightness in her chest threatening to overwhelm her. This was exactly what she'd feared, being back in combat, being responsible for other people's lives. But as she looked at the faces of the operators around her, men who were about to fight and possibly die because of her analysis, something shifted inside her. The fear didn't go away, but it no longer paralyzed her. I'm good, she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. How do you want to play this? Reaper smiled grimly. You're the one who figured out Al's plan. How would you break it? Sarah forced herself to think tactically, to look at the situation as a problem to be solved rather than a nightmare come to life. The insurgents down on that lower ridge don't know we're here yet. That's an advantage. If we hit them first, hit them hard, it'll create chaos. Al's main force will hear the fighting and know their ambush has been compromised. They'll have to make a choice, press the attack or withdraw. And Ali's cautious, Reaper said, following her logic. If his ambush is blown, he might choose to withdraw rather than take casualties. It's our best option. Otherwise, we're going to be pinned between two forces. Reaper nodded decisively. All teams, weapons free. Engage targets on the lower ridge on my mark. Make every shot count. We need them neutralized fast. 3, 2, 1, mark. They erupted with gunfire. 8 JSOC operators, among the most highly trained marksmen in the world, opened fire simultaneously. The insurgents on the lower ridge never had a chance. The first volley dropped at least 8 of them before the others even realized they were under attack. Sarah watched through her scope as the survivors scrambled for cover, returning fire wildly. But they were shooting at the wrong positions, confused about where the attack was coming from. The JSOC operators adjusted their aim and fired again, their discipline and training evident in every shot. Within 90 seconds, the insurgent position was neutralized. Those who weren't dead or wounded had abandoned their weapons and fled. That's how it's done, one of the operators said with satisfaction. But Sarah was already scanning toward the wadi. Movement. Al's main force is accelerating. They know something's wrong. Figures were emerging from the wadi now, spread out in a tactical formation that showed professional training. These weren't running away. They were preparing to assault the JSOC positions. Air support, where are you? Reaper demanded into his radio. 8 minutes out. We need immediate extraction. Can you get birds in here? Negative, too hot. We'll need to secure an LZ first. Reaper swore under his breath. All teams prepare for defensive positions. We're going to have to hold until air support arrives. The next few minutes were chaos. The insurgents advanced in waves, using cover effectively and laying down heavy suppressive fire. The JSOC operators returned fire with precision, but they were outnumbered nearly 6-1. Sarah found herself doing something she hadn't done in 3 years. She raised her rifle, acquired a target through her scope, controlled her breathing. Her finger rested on the trigger, and for a moment she was frozen, memories of flooding her mind. An RPG exploded 50 meters away, showering them with rocks and debris. The operator next to her, a young sergeant, took shrapnel to the arm and went down with a grunt of pain. The fear was still there, the doubt, the guilt, but so were these men who needed her. She wasn't just an analyst anymore. She was a soldier, and soldiers protected each other. Sarah pulled the trigger. The insurgent she'd been aiming at dropped. She worked the rifle's action, acquired another target, fired again. And again. Her training took over, that muscle memory built through thousands of hours on the range. Each shot was precise, calculated, deadly. "That's my girl," Reaper said, dropping an insurgent who'd gotten too close. "Welcome back to the fight." The battle raged for another 6 minutes that felt like hours. The Apache helicopters finally arrived, their 30 cannons tearing through the insurgent positions with devastating effect. The few survivors broke and ran, disappearing back into the wadi. As the sound of gunfire faded, Sarah lowered her rifle and took a shaky breath. She'd done it. She'd faced her fears and hadn't frozen. But as she looked at the young sergeant who was being treated for his wounds, she wondered at what cost. "Reaper, we've got a situation," one of the forward observers called out. "There's a vehicle approaching from the south, single pickup truck driving fast." Sarah raised her spotting scope and focused on the vehicle. Inside, she could see a single occupant, a man in his 40s with graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Even from this distance, there was something about the way he carried himself, the calm confidence in his movements, that set him apart. "That's him," she said with certainty. "That's Al. He's coming to see the results of his ambush." "Can you take the shot?" Reaper asked. Sarah calculated the distance. Nearly 1,400 meters, with wind from the east and heat shimmer distorting the air. It was at the extreme edge of her weapon's effective range, and she hadn't made a shot like this in 3 years. But Al was responsible for dozens of coalition casualties. If he got away now, he would rebuild, plan new attacks, kill more people. This was the moment that could end his threat forever. "I can make it," Sarah said, settling into her shooting position. "But I'll need someone on the spotting scope." Reaper slid over, taking position behind the scope. Wind 3 to 5 miles per hour from east, distance 1370, temperature 94 degrees, call your shot. Sarah controlled her breathing, let her mind slip into that calm, focused state she'd thought was lost to her forever. The rifle felt like an extension of her body, the target impossibly small in her scope but crystal clear in her mind. The world seemed to slow down as the bullet left the barrel. Sarah watched through her scope as the round traveled across nearly 1,400 meters of desert air, fighting wind and gravity with every inch. The mathematical calculations she'd done in her head played out in reality, the trajectory arc perfect, the windage compensation exact. The bullet struck Al in the upper chest just as he was stepping out of the pickup truck. Through her scope, Sarah saw him stumble backward, his expression shifting from confidence to shock in the span of a heartbeat. He collapsed against the side of the vehicle and slid to the ground. "Hit," Reaper confirmed, watching through the spotting scope. "Good shooting, that was one hell of a shot." Sarah didn't respond. She was already working the rifle's action, chambering another round, her scope trained on the fallen insurgent leader. Al wasn't moving, but she'd learned long ago never to assume a target was neutralized until confirmed. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then, impossibly, Al began to move. He pulled himself up using the truck's bumper, his left hand pressed against his chest. Blood was visible on his shirt, but he was alive, conscious, and now trying to get back into the vehicle. "He's wearing body armor," Sarah said, anger flashing through her. "The shot hit center mass but didn't penetrate." She adjusted her aim, leading slightly as Al struggled to pull himself into the driver's seat. Her finger found the trigger again, steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. This time she aimed for the head, a smaller target but one that no body armor could protect. But before she could fire, the pickup truck's engine roared to life. Al accelerated hard, the vehicle fishtailing in the sand as he fled south, away from the American positions. Within seconds, he'd put a rise of terrain between himself and disappearing from view. "Damn it," Sarah muttered, lowering her rifle. "Don't beat yourself up," Reaper said. "That was still an incredible shot at that range. You hit him, body armor or not. He'll be hurting for weeks, and every insurgent in the region just saw their brilliant commander run away with his tail between his legs. That's a psychological victory." Sarah wanted to argue, to point out that Al was still alive and would eventually recover to plan more attacks. But she also recognized the truth in Reaper's words. The carefully planned ambush had failed spectacularly. Al's forces had taken heavy casualties while inflicting minimal damage on the JSOC teams. That kind of lopsided defeat would hurt his credibility among the insurgent networks. The extraction helicopters arrived 15 minutes later, Black Hawks dropping into a secure LZ while the Apache provided overwatch. As Sarah climbed aboard, she took one last look at the battlefield they were leaving behind. Bodies of insurgents lay scattered across the lower ridge and in the Wadi approach. The price of Al's ambition. The flight back to Fob Falcon gave Sarah time to process what had just happened. She'd gone into the field convinced she was broken, that her days as a combat operator were finished. But when the situation demanded it, when her team needed her, she'd performed. Not perfectly, Al had escaped, but well enough to make a difference. The nightmares and panic attacks weren't magically cured. The guilt over death still weighed on her. But maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as broken as she'd believed. Back at the base, the operations center was buzzing with activity. Colonel Bradford met them as they disembarked, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "Good work out there," he said, shaking Reaper's hand before turning to Sarah. "Captain Mitchell, your analysis was spot on. Al's attempt to ambush our forces failed because you saw through his deception." "With respect, sir, it was almost too late," Sarah replied. "If we'd waited another few minutes before engaging, we would have been caught in a crossfire." "But you didn't wait. You recognized the threat and adapted. That's what separates good intelligence officers from great ones." Bradford gestured toward the operations center. "Come on, we've got a lot of people who want to hear your after-action report." The debriefing lasted 3 hours. Sarah walked the command staff through her entire analysis, from the initial assessment of the convoy attacks through the recognition that Al had laid a trap for the JSOC forces. She was frank about her mistakes, about how close they'd come to disaster, but she also highlighted what had worked. "The key is understanding that we're not fighting amateurs anymore," she explained, pointing to intelligence reports spread across the conference table. "Al is representative of a new generation of insurgent leaders. They're educated, professionally trained, and they understand our tactics as well as we understand theirs. Conventional approaches won't work against them." Major leaned forward. "So what do you recommend?" "We need to stay unpredictable. Al set his trap assuming we'd follow standard counterinsurgency procedures. He was right, we did. But we also had the flexibility to recognize when things weren't adding up and adjust accordingly. That adaptability needs to become standard practice." "Easier said than done," one of the battalion commanders commented. "Adaptability requires people who can think creatively under pressure. We can't clone you and put copies in every unit." "No, but we can change how we train. Stop teaching people to follow rigid procedures and start teaching them to think like the enemy. Put yourself in Al's shoes, understand his goals and constraints, and then figure out what he's most likely to do. That's how we stay ahead of him." After the debriefing, Sarah found herself alone in the intelligence center, staring at her computer monitors. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving her exhausted and emotionally drained. She pulled up the personnel file she'd been avoiding for 3 years, the one marked with the highest security classification. 22 years old, killed in action in Afghanistan. His photo showed a young man with an easy smile and bright eyes, someone who'd believed in the mission and trusted his spotter to keep him safe. Sarah had replayed that day 1,000 times in her mind. They'd been tracking a high-value target through mountainous terrain when they'd been compromised by a local shepherd who'd stumbled across their position. The standard procedure would have been to abort the mission, but the target was about to escape across the Pakistani border. Sarah had made the call to continue. 2 hours later, their position had been overrun. Had died covering Sarah's retreat. His body recovered 3 days later after a major operation to retake the area. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the photo on her screen. "I'm so sorry." But even as she said the words, she realized something had changed. The guilt was still there, would probably always be there, but it no longer paralyzed her. Had died doing a job they'd both volunteered for, protecting his team and completing the mission. He wouldn't want her to spend the rest of her life punishing herself. Captain Mitchell. Sarah turned to find Lieutenant standing in the doorway, looking hesitant. Lieutenant, what can I do for you? I heard what happened out there, heard you saved the team by spotting Al's trap. He stepped into the room. I just wanted to say thank you. My brother is with the 101st Airborne. He's stationed at Camp Victory. If Al had hit that base today, Josh might have been killed, so thank you. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. This was why she did this work, why she'd joined the military in the first place. Not for glory or recognition, but to protect people like's brother, young soldiers who were just trying to do their jobs and make it home alive. You're welcome, she managed to say. After left, Sarah pulled up the latest intelligence reports on Al. The wounded insurgent leader had been spotted crossing into Syria several hours after the firefight, confirming that he'd survived. But signals intelligence indicated his network was in disarray, with several of his lieutenants dead and others arguing about who should take command. The operation hadn't killed Al, but it had dealt a significant blow to his organization. It would be months, maybe years, before he could rebuild to his previous strength. In the meantime, American forces and Iraqi civilians would be safer. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough. Over the next week, Sarah fell back into her routine as an intelligence analyst. She studied reports, tracked insurgent movements, and provided assessments to operational commanders. But something was different now. She no longer felt like she was hiding in the intelligence center, using analysis as a shield to avoid the dangers of combat. Instead, she understood that her work was combat, just fought with data and insight rather than bullets. The JSOC team departed after 5 days, heading to their next mission. Before he left, Reaper stopped by the intelligence center to say goodbye. You know, we could use someone like you permanently, he said, leaning against her desk. JSOC is always looking for officers who can think tactically and analytically. You've got a rare skill set. Sarah smiled but shook her head. I appreciate the offer, but I think I'm where I need to be. Turns out I can do more good here than I ever could behind a rifle. Maybe so, but if you ever change your mind, you know where to find us. He extended his hand. It was an honor working with you, Captain. The honor was mine. After Reaper left, Sarah received an encrypted message from Baghdad. It was from a colonel in the intelligence directorate who'd been following her work. Captain Mitchell, your analysis and actions during Operation Serpent's Nest were exemplary. I'm recommending you for a Bronze Star with Valor. Additionally, there's a position opening up in Baghdad with the Joint Intelligence Operations Center. We need people who can do what you do, who can think like both an analyst and an operator. If you're interested, the job is yours. Sarah stared at the message for a long time. A position in Baghdad would mean more responsibility, more influence, the chance to shape intelligence operations across the entire theater. It was an opportunity most captains would kill for. But it would also mean leaving Fob Falcon, leaving the team she'd built with and the other analysts, leaving the small corner of the war where she felt she was making a real difference. Before she could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway outside the intelligence center. Sarah heard shouting, the kind of controlled chaos that meant something big was happening. She stepped out to find Major striding toward her, his face urgent. Mitchell, we've got a situation. 3 soldiers from a resupply convoy are missing. Their vehicle broke down 20 clicks northeast of here, and when a recovery team arrived, the soldiers were gone. Signs of a struggle. Sarah felt ice run through her veins. Captured Americans were every commander's nightmare. The propaganda value alone made them high-priority targets for insurgent groups, to say nothing of the intelligence they might be forced to reveal. How long have they been missing? 2 hours, but we've intercepted radio chatter suggesting they're being moved toward the Syrian border. If they cross into Syria, we'll never get them back. Do we know which group has them? Pulled up a map on his tablet showing the location of the ambush. Best guess, Al's network. This is right in his operating area. Sarah studied the map, her mind already working through the implications. Al was wounded, his network in disarray, but capturing 3 American soldiers would be a huge propaganda victory for him. It would restore his credibility and prove that he was still a force to be reckoned with. He'll want to get them across the border fast, Sarah said, thinking aloud. But he's also cautious. He won't use the main highways where we might spot them. Instead, he'll use back roads and desert routes. She pulled up a topographical map, overlaying it with known insurgent smuggling routes. There were dozens of paths through the desert that could lead to Syria, too many to cover with the limited forces available. "We need to narrow this down," said. "Give me something I can work with." Sarah closed her eyes, visualizing the terrain, thinking like Al. He was wounded, probably in pain, definitely angry about his failed ambush. He'd want to personally oversee something this important to prove to his network that he was still in control. But he was also smart enough to know that coalition forces would be scouring the area. He'd avoid the most direct routes in favor of paths that offered more cover, more opportunities to hide if aircraft spotted him. She opened her eyes and pointed to a narrow valley that snaked through a series of low hills. "There, the Wadi Al. It's longer than the direct routes, but it offers excellent concealment from aerial observation. And look here," she traced her finger along the map. "It connects to 3 different crossing points into Syria. He can keep us guessing about his exact destination until the last minute." "How confident are you about this?" Sarah met's eyes, confident enough to stake those soldiers' lives on it. "Then that's good enough for me," pulled out his radio. "All units, this is TOC. We have a probable route for the missing soldiers. Prepare for immediate deployment to Wadi Al." Within 30 minutes, every available unit on the base was mobilizing. Attack helicopters, quick reaction forces, even the base commander's personal security detachment. The message was clear. No American soldier would be abandoned, not while there was still a chance of rescue. Sarah found herself in a command Humvee, racing across the desert alongside Major and a squad of infantry. The vehicle bounced and jolted over rough terrain, but Sarah barely noticed. She was focused on the tablet in her hands, watching real-time updates from the drone coverage that had been redirected to the search area. "There," she said suddenly, pointing to the screen. "2 vehicles moving through the wadi. They're traveling without lights, trying to stay hidden." Grabbed the radio. "All units, we have visual contact. 2 vehicles heading northwest through Wadi Al. Air units, get me confirmation on those targets." An Apache pilot came back seconds later. "TOC, this is Sabre 16. I have visual on the vehicles. Confirmed 2 pickup trucks with multiple personnel in the beds. One of the individuals appears to be wearing American-style combat fatigues." "That's them," Sarah said. "We need to stop those vehicles before they reach the Syrian border." "Sabre 16, you are cleared to disable the vehicles. Repeat, disable only. We have American personnel aboard." "Roger, disabling fires." Through the tablet's feed, Sarah watched as the Apache swept in low, its 30 cannon barking briefly. Rounds struck the lead vehicle's engine block, and the truck lurched to a stop in a cloud of steam and smoke. The second vehicle tried to swerve around it but became stuck in the soft sand of the wadi floor. Figures jumped out of both trucks, some taking defensive positions while others tried to pull something or someone from the back of the disabled vehicle. "They're going to try to move the hostages on foot," Sarah said. "We need ground units there now." Was already on it, directing the quick reaction forces to converge on the wadi. But Sarah could see on the map that they were still 10 minutes away. In 10 minutes, the insurgents could disappear into the network of caves and hidden positions that honeycombed these hills. Unless someone could slow them down. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed insane a week ago. "Major, I need you to drop me off here." Looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "What? No, you're an intelligence officer, not an assault trooper." "I'm also a trained sniper, and there's about 800 meters from those vehicles that would give me a perfect overwatch position. I can keep the insurgents pinned down until our forces arrive." "Captain, I cannot authorize you to." "Sir, with respect, those are American soldiers down there. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you what I'm going to do." For a moment, the 2 officers locked eyes, then sighed. "You're going to get me court-martialed. Driver, stop the vehicle." The Humvee skidded to a halt, and Sarah was out before it fully stopped, pulling her rifle from the back. She sprinted toward her body protesting after days of relative inactivity but her training pushing her forward. She reached the ridge and dropped into a shooting position, her breathing controlled despite the hard run. Through her scope, she could see the scene in the wadi clearly. The insurgents were trying to move three figures whose hands appeared to be bound, the captured American soldiers. One of the insurgents was shouting orders, and even at this distance, Sarah recognized him. Al, the wounded insurgent leader, had been in one of the trucks, probably overseeing the transfer of his valuable prisoners personally. Sarah settled the scope's crosshairs on Al's chest. This time, she aimed lower, below where body armor would normally protect. At 800 meters, it was a difficult shot but well within her capabilities. Her finger found the trigger and she began to apply pressure. Then she stopped. Killing Al would feel satisfying, would be justified given the American blood on his hands. But it wouldn't save those three soldiers. In fact, it might get them killed in the chaos that would follow. Instead, Sarah shifted her aim to the insurgent standing next to Al, a tall man with an RPG slung over his shoulder. She fired, and the insurgent dropped. Before the others could react, she worked the bolt and fired again, hitting another fighter who'd been pointing an AK-47 at one of the hostages. The insurgents dove for cover, confused and unable to locate where the shots were coming from. Al was shouting orders, trying to maintain control, but his men were scattered, more concerned with survival than guarding prisoners. Sarah continued firing, not trying to kill everyone but rather to create maximum chaos and fear. Every few shots, she'd shift position slightly, making it seem like there were multiple shooters. The insurgents returned fire wildly, shooting at shadows and phantoms. Then she heard the beautiful sound of helicopter rotors. The Apache were making another pass, their mere presence enough to break the insurgents' will. Men began running from the wadi, abandoning their weapons and fleeing into the hills. Al remained, still trying to rally his forces, but it was hopeless. Ground units were arriving now, Humvees and armored vehicles converging on the wadi from multiple directions. The insurgent leader finally recognized defeat. He looked directly up at Sarah's position, as if he knew exactly where she was, then turned and ran. Sarah tracked him through her scope. One shot. That's all it would take to end this threat permanently. But coalition forces were everywhere now, too close to Al for Sarah to safely take the shot without risking friendly fire. She lowered her rifle and watched as the insurgent leader disappeared into the hills. Again, he'd escaped, but this time he left behind his prisoners. American soldiers swarmed the wadi, quickly securing the three hostages and providing medical treatment. Through her scope, Sarah watched as the rescued soldiers were helped into vehicles, alive and relatively unharmed. Mission accomplished. Major found her an hour later, still on the, "You know, when I said you couldn't go, that wasn't a suggestion." "I know, sir. I'm sure there's paperwork we'll need to fill out." Laughed. "Paperwork. Right. Captain, you just single-handedly held off a dozen armed insurgents and facilitated the rescue of 3 American soldiers. The paperwork is going to be recommendations for medals, not reprimands." Sarah finally lowered her rifle and stood, her muscles aching. "Did they identify the soldiers? Are they okay?" "Bruised, dehydrated, scared out of their minds, but alive. One of them is 19 years old, been in country for less than a month. Thanks to you, he gets to go home to his family." Back at Fob Falcon, Sarah was greeted as a hero. The rescued soldiers wanted to meet her, to thank the mysterious sniper who'd saved their lives. She spoke with them briefly, deflecting their gratitude and instead praising the quick reaction forces and air units that had made the rescue possible. But that night, alone in her quarters, Sarah allowed herself to feel proud of what she'd accomplished. Not just the rescue, but everything that had led to it. She'd faced her demons, confronted the trauma that had been holding her back, and emerged stronger. The message from Baghdad was still waiting for her, the offer of a prestigious position in the Joint Intelligence Operations Center. Sarah read it again, considering the possibilities. She could have a real impact in Baghdad, influence operations across the entire theater. But she could also have an impact right here, at a small forward operating base where her unique combination of skills was desperately needed. She thought about Lieutenant, about the young soldiers who depended on good intelligence to stay alive, about the difference one dedicated analyst could make. Sarah opened a reply to the colonel in Baghdad. "Sir, thank you for the offer and the recommendation. However, I believe I can be most effective here at Fob Falcon. The work we're doing matters, and I'd like to continue being part of this team." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to Sarah's life. She remained in the intelligence center, but with a new confidence in her abilities and her role. She trained other analysts in her methods, teaching them to think like both hunters and prey, to understand the enemy's perspective. Al's network continued to fracture. The failed ambush and the botched hostage situation had damaged his reputation severely. Several of his key lieutenants were captured in raids based on Sarah's intelligence. The coalition wouldn't admit it publicly, but the Ghost Brigade had been effectively neutralized as a fighting force. Al himself remained at large, reportedly hiding somewhere in Syria. But he was no longer the threat he'd once been, reduced to a cautionary tale about what happened when insurgent leaders got too ambitious. 3 months after the hostage rescue, Sarah received a package from the United States. Inside was a bronze star with Valor device, along with a letter from the rescued soldiers thanking her for saving their lives. She placed the medal in her locker next to a photo of. "I'm trying to do better," she said to Sfodo. "Trying to honor what you sacrificed by being the best soldier I can be. I hope that's enough." One evening, as Sarah was preparing to leave the intelligence center, Lieutenant approached her with a tablet. "Captain, I've been working on something, and I wanted you to see it before I submitted up the chain." On the screen was a comprehensive analysis of insurgent networks throughout the region, using the methodology Sarah had taught him. It was thorough, insightful, and would provide actionable intelligence for months to come. "This is excellent work, Lieutenant, really excellent." Beamed at the praise. "I learned from the best. Captain, can I ask you something? When you were out there in the Wadi, facing down those insurgents alone, were you scared?" Sarah thought about lying, about giving him some brave-sounding answer about duty and training, but deserved the truth. "Terrified," she admitted. "Every time I go out there, I'm scared. Scared I'll make a mistake, scared someone will die because of me, scared I'll freeze up when it matters most. But I've learned that fear doesn't have to stop you. It just means you understand the stakes." "How do you deal with it?" "By remembering why I'm here. Every piece of intelligence we gather, every analysis we provide, it saves lives. That kid who was captured, the 19-year-old, he's going home because we did our jobs. That's what makes the fear worthwhile." Nodded slowly. "Thank you, ma'am, for teaching me that." After he left, Sarah stood alone in the intelligence center, looking at the maps and data streams that had become her battlefield. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a sniper who could barely function to an intelligence officer who'd found a new way to fight. The transition hadn't been easy. The scars, both physical and psychological, would never fully heal. But she'd learned that being broken didn't mean being useless. Sometimes the pieces fit together in new ways, creating something different but just as valuable. Her radio crackled to life. "Captain Mitchell, this is TOC. We've got new intelligence on insurgent activity in Sector 7. Can you take a look?" Sarah smiled and keyed her radio. "On my way." There was always another mission, another threat to analyze, another life to save. The war would continue, with or without her. But as long as she could make a difference, as long as she could use her skills to protect the soldiers who depended on her intelligence, she would keep fighting. Not with a rifle anymore, but with her mind. And in this war, that might be the most powerful weapon of all. Years later, long after her deployment ended and she'd returned to the United States, Sarah would sometimes get emails from soldiers she'd never met. They were serving in Iraq or Afghanistan or some other distant battlefield, and they'd heard the stories about the Analyst, the intelligence officer who'd once been a JSOC sniper. They wanted advice on how to deal with combat stress, how to keep going when the weight of responsibility felt crushing, how to transition from one military role to another. Sarah always took the time to respond, sharing what she'd learned through painful experience. "Fear is normal," she would tell them. "Doubt is natural. But neither one defines you. What defines you is what you do despite the fear, how you push forward despite the doubt. Every soldier has a role to play, and every role matters." Some people served on the front lines, pulling triggers and kicking down doors. Others served in operations centers, moving pieces on a map and coordinating strikes. Still others served in intelligence cells, finding patterns in chaos and predicting the enemy's next move. None of these roles was more important than the others. They were all part of the same mission, all necessary pieces of a larger whole. Sarah had been fortunate enough to serve in multiple roles, to see the war from different perspectives. And while her time as a trigger puller had ended, her time as a warrior had not. She'd simply found a different way to fight. The nightmares never completely stopped. Some nights, Sarah still woke up gasping, face fresh in her mind. But she'd learned to live with them, to understand that they were the price of caring, of fighting for something bigger than herself. And when the nightmares came, she would remind herself of the soldiers she'd saved, the attacks she'd prevented, the lives that continued because of her work. She'd think about the 19-year-old hostage who got to go home to his family, about Lieutenant learning to become a better analyst, about every small victory in a war that often seemed endless. Then she would get up, make coffee, and prepare for another day of fighting the good fight. Because that's what soldiers did. They endured, they adapted, and they never gave up. They called her the Analyst, and for a long time, Sarah had thought that was a demotion, a step down from the elite sniper she'd once been. But she'd come to understand that it was simply a different kind of service, equally important, equally honorable. In the end, it didn't matter what they called her. What mattered was that when soldiers needed her, when lives were on the line, she was there. Thinking, analyzing, fighting her own battles in her own way. And sometimes, when the situation demanded it, she was still that sniper who could make the impossible shot, who could read the wind and the terrain and the enemy's intentions, all in the space of a single breath. They called her the Analyst, until enemy forces met a JSOC sniper who'd found a new way to hunt. "Send it," Reaper said quietly. She pulled the trigger. "I'll do it," she heard herself say, "but I'll need access to my old equipment." Reaper's smile was genuine this time. "Now we're talking. Welcome back to the fight, Analyst."